The movie opens with an African-American man named Charles Blakey, who's drinking and playing cards with his friends, Ricky and Clarence. We soon learn that Charles is drowning in debt, and the bank is about to seize his house if he doesn't pay his loan on time. His friends urge him to get a job, and Ricky even offers to hook him up with construction work, but Charles just responds with a maybe. This annoys Clarence, who calls him ungrateful, and asks if he thinks he's some kind of prince who doesn't have to work. Charles responds with an awful insult, which escalates into a physical fight. But Ricky steps in and calms Clarence down. Before leaving, Clarence angrily tells Charles that he hopes the bank takes his house away. The next morning, Charles is visited by an unfamiliar man, who introduces himself as Aniston Bennett, and starts questioning him about the basement. Charles insists that the house isn't for sale, but the man surprisingly reveals that he only wants to rent the basement for a while. Charles still refuses, so Aniston leaves his card and asks him to call if he changes his mind. Later, Charles attempts to make breakfast, only to discover he's nearly out of groceries, and can't even afford a loaf of bread. His car is also low on fuel, with no way to pay for a refill. The desperate man then heads to the construction site where Ricky works, but they also refuse to hire him. Afterward, Charles goes to meet a relative who works at a bank, but she's also grown tired of helping him. She informs him that the bank has decided to seize his home to recover the debt, which she thinks is for the best. Despite this, Charles refuses to give up and calls his aunt to ask for some money. But she is furious that he's losing a house that has been in their family for 8 generations. She's even more disappointed that he only calls when he needs something and refuses to help him. With no other options left, Charles calls Aniston's number and leaves a voicemail to discuss the proposal. He then heads to the backyard, which turns out to be a cemetery where his family members are buried. Soon, he arrives at the basement and is shocked to find a dead dog lying there, seemingly left abandoned for a long time. The next morning, he calls Ricky for help in clearing out the basement, which contains a lot of old items. Charles insists he'll just throw everything away, but Ricky insists that these antiques could be worth a fortune and suggests selling them instead. He knows someone who can connect them with an antique dealer in exchange for a 10% commission. The next day, a woman named Narcissus arrives. She carefully looks around and is amazed by several unique items, many of which appear to be centuries old. Later, Narcissus discovers some ancient masks and tells Charles that his ancestors must have brought them from West Africa. But Charles barely pays attention, since he's distracted by strange noises coming from upstairs. Narcissus then assures him that he could get between $40,000 and $100,000 for everything except the masks. She adds that she will return soon to take pictures of everything, and in the meantime, he must keep the masks close to him. That evening, Charles gets a call from Aniston, who will need the basement for exactly 65 days, and will pay $65,000 for the entire lease. Upon hearing this, Charles is in utter disbelief, as he hadn't expected such a large amount. Aniston will give $10,000 as a deposit, $25,000 when he moves in, and the remaining half when the lease expires, all in cash. He then warns Charles not to tell anyone about the deal, to which the man agrees without hesitation. The next day, Charles receives a delivery for the basement and discovers that Aniston has sent a lot of stuff for his stay. He has also sent some money, which fills Charles with joy. Without wasting a moment, he heads to the bank and humiliates a banker before paying off his debts. He also fills his car with gas and stocks the refrigerator full of groceries. Days later, Charles arrives at a train station to pick up Aniston. Once they arrive at the basement, Aniston decides to treat him to a glass of expensive whiskey, and they begin to get to know each other. Charles asks about his business, and the old man explains that he runs a reclamation process, which searches for treasures beneath someone's property, like diamonds. He then acquires the property and contacts those who can mine it, which earns him a large commission. Aniston then hands him the $25,000 as agreed, after which Charles leaves him alone and heads upstairs. The next morning, when Charles returns to the basement with a coffee, he is horrified to see that Aniston has built a cage with a toilet and has locked himself inside. The old man explains that he wants to isolate himself from the world and asks Charles to bring him meals every day, while he focuses on reading and writing. Charles finds this bizarre and refuses, but Aniston requests to stay for at least 2 weeks. After that, if Charles wants him gone, he will leave, but if allowed to stay, he will double the final payment. Charles reluctantly agrees, so Aniston hands him the key to the cage to ensure he cannot get out on his own. To avoid being caught in this bizarre situation, Charles locks the basement doors securely and even covers the windows so no one can see Aniston inside. That evening, he brings the old man food and also gives him a flexible faucet to use for washing the dishes. The next day, Charles visits a local library and decides to search the internet for information about Aniston, but finds nothing. He then returns home and spends his time engaging in philosophical conversations with the old man. At one point, Charles asks Aniston if he's ever been to Africa. When the old man says yes, Charles shows him the antique masks and asks if he knows anything about them. Aniston then asks for a pocket knife, and when he carefully scrapes off the paint, it reveals gold underneath, leaving Charles completely stunned. In the next scene, Charles arrives at Narcissa's house and shows her the mask plated with gold, which shocks her as well. He says he might not be the only one with such treasures, that there could be others too. He proposes a deal: they could drive around and offer their services to other families, and go through their antique stuff for a commission. But Narcissa refuses and is annoyed that he wants to turn his heritage into merchandise. That evening, Charles returns home late and finds Aniston furious because he hasn't received a meal all day. But a frustrated Charles also snaps back and demands to know why he's hiding here, and asks if he's a criminal. Shockingly, Aniston admits that he is, but swears no law enforcement is after him. Charles presses to know what he's done, but Aniston refuses to say anything and simply reminds him not to forget his meals next time. Later, while Charles is freshening up, he suddenly notices his skin peeling away, revealing a thick layer of gold underneath. But then, when he looks again, he notices that his skin has returned to normal and dismisses it as a hallucination. The next evening, Charles spends some time drinking with his friends and apologizes to Clarence for what happened during their last meeting. While driving home, Charles closes his eyes before taking his hands off the steering wheel, and it seems like he wants to end his life. And then all of a sudden, the shocked man rushes out to check, and upon seeing the lifeless animal, he's overwhelmed with guilt. Upon returning home, Charles tells Aniston that their 2-week trial period is almost over, and he must leave afterward. Here a desperate Aniston decides to reveal shocking information and says that his first job was as an accountant in Tehran. To test his loyalty, his employers once took him to a cell and ordered him to kill a man, which he did without hesitation. Upon hearing this, Charles is horrified and realizes Aniston came here seeking redemption, because the dead man was also black. He now gets even more determined than ever to kick him out of the house, but Aniston argues that he knows Charles still needs the money. Next, he suddenly narrates Charles's life story, including where he went to high school, became a football star, and got into an average college because of it. He reveals that Charles's father died young, and after college, he returned home to care for his mother. But when she passed away, Charles had to look after his uncle Brent, who was very cruel. Aniston even knows that Charles once worked at a bank, where he stole $433, and got fired, leaving him broke and buried under a $68,000 mortgage. In a shocking twist, Aniston reveals that it was actually him who offered a high price for the house and pushed the bank to start the foreclosure. Upon hearing this, Charles is horrified and decides to kick him out. However, Aniston argues that Charles's situation won't change whether he stays or leaves. And so, a frustrated Charles decides to give him real punishment and declares that from tonight onward, Aniston is his prisoner, and he is the warden. The enraged man then turns off the basement lights and storms upstairs. The next morning, Charles returns to the basement and tells Aniston that everything from now on to food, water, books, and even lights will be a privilege. He explains that he will ask some questions, and if he doesn't like the answers, one privilege will be taken away. Aniston has only one right: he can request to be released at any time, and Charles will let him go 96 hours after that. Aniston then adds a condition that after every 3 answers, he will ask a question of his own, which Charles must answer honestly. Next, they begin asking each other a series of questions, and Aniston reveals that he is an American citizen and was born in the US. Up next, Charles asks him if he has ever murdered anyone. The old man responds no, explaining that he only shot and killed that man following orders from legal government representatives. Aniston then asks him the same question, to which Charles responds no before leaving. The next morning, Charles spits on Aniston's coffee, and they resume their QA session. Charles asks how he makes money, and the old man explains that individuals, corporations, and sometimes governments pay him to obtain and reclaim properties that are meaningful to them, and sometimes it can be illegal. When Charles asks why he chose his house, Aniston reveals that he was the perfect specimen, a lonely black man with enormous debt and a sizable basement. Aniston even calls him the perfect failure of their race, which enrages Charles so much that he turns off the lights and says he will return in 4 days. That evening, Narcissus comes to visit Charles and says she has a proposal for him. She asks if he would be interested in opening an African American museum, where they would display his relics along with some antique items from her store. This way, he could earn money without giving up his family heirlooms. Charles agrees, and they begin joking and discussing names for the antique masks. One thing leads to another, and they end up kissing, but their moment is abruptly interrupted when they hear strange sounds. But Charles claims it's just a fox screaming and says he will chase it away, and he knows it's Aniston screaming in the basement. Charles thus quickly sends Narcissus away, saying it's too late, something she finds extremely rude. Days later, Charles finally goes to meet Aniston, who thanks him and says that his time has begun. He reveals how all the people he killed and tortured came to him in the darkness. He then begins recounting all the atrocities he has committed, including the time he fed a 9-month-old baby to a hungry dog on someone's orders. However, he tries to justify himself, claiming that he has also saved thousands of lives, and that the baby would have died one way or another. Upon hearing this, Charles is shaken to his core and proceeds to leave. Even though Aniston begs him not to cut off the light, he refuses and switches off the bulb. That evening, Charles arrives at a party of his close friends, where he notices Narcissus as well, and the two awkwardly stare at each other. Frustrated, he begins drinking and soon hallucinates a strange dog, which prompts him to flee from the party. Soon, Charles returns to his house and senses someone's presence, so he arms himself with a shovel. He looks carefully around and notices the television on. As he moves closer, he watches a montage of several clips showing the suffering of black people throughout history. His hands suddenly appear bloodied, and he sees the same dog devouring the innocent deer he once hit. The dog starts barking, and a terrified Charles runs upstairs and hides under a bed. Moments later, a man, who turns out to be his dead uncle Brent, enters the room to beat him for his bad behavior. This is obviously a hallucination, but it implies that Brent was an abusive person who used to beat Charles in his childhood. Before Brent can reach him, Charles runs away from the house, while recalling his teenage years and soon falls into the sea. While in the water, he sees a woman nearby, and she seems to be his mother. Later on, Charles returns to his house and heads to one of the rooms, where he sees his uncle dying and begging for help. Charles breaks down in tears and feels his mother's hand on his shoulder, after which he leaves the room. Disturbed by these events, he finally decides to visit Aniston, but finds the man in a horrible and filthy state. Aniston quickly threatens to kill him, so Charles warns that in that case, they would both end up dead. Here, Charles demands that he tell him who he is, or he can go back into the darkness. When asked his real name, Aniston reveals that his birth name is Tamal Nosos, but that he never knew his parents. His birth certificate lists his mother, Maria Nosos, as Greek and unmarried, while his father appears only as Tamal, with Turkish nationality. Charles then removes his blue contact lens, and explains that when he grew up, he gave himself a new name, and adopted the surname Bennett from a powerful British family. Upon hearing this, Charles begins mocking him, saying that since he never knew his father, he could be anything, such as Arab, Indian, or even African. But Aniston angrily insists that he is as white as the sun. After this, Charles surprisingly calms down and gives the old man a bath, and some food before finally providing a new light bulb and a book. Afterward, Charles finally admits that he killed his uncle by letting him die. He reveals how he was angry that he had been left alone in the house to care for the man he had hated his entire life. And so, he stopped answering his calls, and eventually those calls turned into screams, which he ignored. Charles waited for the screams to stop, and in the end, his uncle passed away because of the neglect. Aniston is stunned to hear this, and it seems that Charles has been overwhelmed with guilt ever since this incident. The next morning, he finally decides to vacate his uncle's room and notices a little girl in a dog mask outside, who glances at him before leaving. He then heads to the basement with a meal for Aniston, only to find the old man lying lifelessly. He has left behind a letter, explaining that he came here in search of answers in books, but ultimately discovered the true answers while trapped in the darkness. Charles buries Aniston in the cemetery in the yard, alongside his family members. To add, the man even left letters to be delivered to his business associates and family so they could mourn him, but Charles doesn't care and burns them. Aniston also left a red pill for Charles, which could grant a fast and painless death if he ever chooses to use it. However, Charles decides to take a different path and begins building a purposeful life. He and Narcissus transform his house into a museum, where they display the ancient relics for the world to see. The movie ends with Charles living in the basement cage, reading books, and continuing his journey of redemption. Thus, we reach the end of this movie. Thanks for watching. If you like the movie, support us. Don't forget to subscribe for more movie recaps. See you in the next movie. Goodbye.